My name is Caroline Jones, and I am 34 years old. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage when my phone rang. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 years, not because of one big fight, not because of some dramatic falling out that I could point to and say, "That's where it broke," but because of 1,000 small moments that had stacked up over 31 years until the weight of them finally crushed whatever was left of what I thought our relationship was supposed to be. I stared at her name on the screen. Mom, just that word, plain and glowing, and my chest did this thing it still does sometimes, a squeeze like someone grabbing a fist around your heart, not to hurt you but just to remind you it's still there, still soft, still capable of being reached. I let it ring. 4 times, 5, then it stopped. I sat there for another 10 minutes before I went inside to finish my shift. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the thing about a story like this. You want to start at the end because the end is where everything finally made sense, but to understand the end you have to go back to the beginning, and the beginning is ordinary and sad in the way that most beginnings are. No single catastrophe, just a slow erosion, the kind of damage that doesn't look like damage from the outside because it leaves no marks you can photograph. So let me start where it actually starts. Let me start with the grapes. I was 7 years old and my sister Diane was 5. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, which in our house meant my father was watching football in the living room, and my mother was in the kitchen doing the specific kind of nothing that looks like something, wiping counters, moving things from one place to another, sighing in a way that was meant to be heard. We lived in a 2-story colonial in a small city in Ohio that was not quite suburban and not quite rural, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, but nobody really knew anyone, if you understand what I mean. The kind of place where appearances mattered more than most people would admit. I was hungry. It was 3 in the afternoon and lunch had been sandwiches at noon and dinner wasn't until 6, and I was 7 and I was hungry. So I went to the refrigerator and took out the bowl of green grapes that had been sitting on the second shelf. I took the bowl to the kitchen table and I started eating them, one by one, the way I always did, popping them against the roof of my mouth with my tongue first to feel the resistance before they split. Diane came in from the backyard. She was muddy from whatever she'd been doing out there, her yellow sneakers leaving faint smudges on the linoleum, and she sat down across from me and reached into the bowl and took a handful of grapes without asking. I pulled the bowl toward myself, not angrily, just instinctively. It was my bowl, I'd gotten it. Diane's face crumpled immediately. She let out a cry, not a real cry, not the kind that comes from actual pain, but the kind that 5-year-olds deploy like a weapon because they've learned it works. And my mother came out of her counter wiping nothing and looked at the scene, me with the bowl, Diane with her face, and said without asking a single question, "Caroline, share with your sister." "I am sharing," I said. "She already took some." "Don't be selfish." That word, selfish, I have turned it over in my hands so many times in the years since that it has gone smooth like sea glass. At 7, it hit me like a slap because I genuinely did not understand what I had done wrong. At 17, it made me furious. At 27, it just made me tired. And now, at 34, I understand it for what it was, not a moral judgment about my character, but a reflex. A habit my mother had developed so early in our childhoods that she probably didn't even know she was doing it. Diane cried, Caroline was blamed. It was an equation as automatic as breathing. I pushed the bowl across the table to Diane. She stopped crying immediately. She took more grapes. My mother went back to the counter. I sat there and watched my sister eat and felt, for the first time that I can consciously remember, the specific loneliness of being in a room full of people who are supposed to love you. I want to be careful here not to paint my parents as monsters because they weren't. My father, Gerald Jones, was a mechanical engineer who worked long hours and came home tired and retreated into football and woodworking and the particular silence of a man who does not have the language for his own emotional life. He wasn't cruel. He was just absent in the way that a lot of fathers of his generation were absent, physically present, emotionally somewhere else. He called me Care Bear until I was 12, which I hated and also secretly loved, and he taught me how to change a tire when I was 15 and made the best chili I've ever tasted every New Year's Eve. He was a real person with real dimensions. He just had a blind spot about Diane. My mother, Ruth Jones, was more complicated. She was the daughter of a woman who had shown love primarily through criticism, and she had internalized this so completely that she didn't know she was doing the same thing to me. She was intelligent, genuinely intelligent, the the kind of person who read 3 books a week and could hold a conversation about almost anything, and she was funny sometimes in a dry way that caught you off guard. She had wanted to be a teacher, but had married my father at 22, and had me at 23 and Diane at 25, and had set that want aside so quietly and so completely that by the time I was old enough to ask her about it, she looked at me blankly, like I'd asked about someone else's life. She loved Diane more. I don't say this as accusation anymore. I say it as fact, the way you say it's raining or the car needs gas. I have sat with therapists and friends and my own conscience and turned this over from every angle and come back to the same conclusion. My mother loved both of her daughters, but she loved Diane differently, in a way that was more visible and more generous and more unconditional. I don't know why. Maybe it was because Diane was the easier baby. I apparently screamed for the first 4 months of my life, and she slept through the night from week 2. Maybe it was because Diane looked more like my mother, same dark hair and wide eyes, while I took after my father's side with my sandy hair and my long face and my tendency toward quiet. Maybe it was something my mother couldn't even name, some intangible click of personality that happened between her and Diane and didn't happen between her and me. Whatever it was, it shaped everything. Diane got the bigger bedroom when we moved to a new house when I was 9, because she needed more space for her things. I got the room next to the bathroom, which smelled faintly of mildew no matter what we did to it. When Diane wanted to take dance classes, she took dance classes. When I wanted to take art classes, my parents said they couldn't afford it right now, and then 6 weeks later signed Diane up for a second dance class. When Diane got a B on a test, my mother called the teacher to discuss it. When I got a B on a test, my mother asked if I'd studied hard enough. The grades thing is particularly interesting to me now, as an adult who understands more about psychology than I did then, because I was actually the better student. I got mostly As. Diane got mostly BS and CS, but somehow my As were expected, just the baseline, and Diane's BS was celebrated as hard-won victories. Diane was trying so hard, she was giving it her best, wasn't it wonderful? And meanwhile I was trying hard too, was also giving it my best, and the response was a nod and a good, keep it up before my mother went back to whatever she was doing. I internalized this as a child the way children internalize everything, not as a political statement about fairness but as information about myself. The information was, you are not as important, you are not as beloved, you are not the one people look at when they walk into a room. This is not a catastrophe, you will be fine, but it is the truth and you should know it. I spent most of my childhood trying to earn my way out of this truth, getting better grades, being less difficult, taking up less space, asking for less, saying I was fine when I wasn't, saying I didn't want things when I did, making myself smaller and quieter and easier so that maybe someday my mother would look at me the way she looked at Diane. She never did, and by the time I was a teenager I had stopped trying. High school was the first place I ever felt competent. I was good at science, specifically biology, specifically the way living things were organized at the cellular level, the way each tiny structure had a purpose. The way everything worked together with a logic that felt, to me, both alien and deeply reassuring. My biology teacher, Mr. Aldridge, was a thin man with a grey beard and an enthusiasm for mitochondria that should have been embarrassing but was somehow infectious. He was the first adult in my life who treated me like I was interesting. You ask better questions than most of my students twice your age, he told me once after class, when I'd stayed behind to ask him something about enzyme inhibition that I'd read about in a library book. He said it matter-of-factly, not trying to flatter me, and that was why it landed. Have you thought about medicine? I hadn't. I'd thought about it the way you think about becoming an astronaut when you're 12, as a fantasy belonging to a different kind of person. But something about the way he said it made it feel less like a fantasy and more like a direction. I went home that afternoon and told my mother, Mr. Aldridge thinks I should think about going into medicine. She was making dinner. She didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. That's nice, honey, could you set the table? I set the table. Diane came home an hour later from dance practice and announced that her instructor thought she had the potential to audition for a regional dance company, and my mother turned from the stove with her whole face open and said, "Oh, Di, that's wonderful," and hugged her. I put out the forks and knives and told myself it didn't matter. It mattered. I want to tell you about the summer I was 16, because this is where the story begins to turn darker, slowly. The way a sky changes before a storm without you noticing until the light is completely different. I had a job that summer at a pharmacy on Clement Street, working the register and stocking shelves 4 days a week. I'd gotten the job myself, answered the ad in the window, went in and asked to speak to the manager, filled out the application in the manager's office while she watched, which was terrifying. The manager was a woman named Sandra Okafor, who was in her early 40s at the time and had a laugh that started somewhere deep in her chest and arrived at her mouth about 2 seconds later. She hired me on the spot. I loved that job. I loved the smell of it, that antiseptic and cardboard smell, and I loved the way the morning light came through the front windows and fell across the vitamin aisle, and I loved Sandra, who talked to me like I was a person with a brain. She'd quiz me on medications while we stocked shelves, not to test me but because she found it interesting and thought I might too. She was right. I started saving money that summer, not for anything specific, just saving it because saving felt like building something, like creating a distance between myself and the feeling of dependence that had always made me vaguely anxious. By the end of August, I had $412 in a savings account that I had opened myself, at the bank 2 blocks from the pharmacy, without telling my parents. My parents found out about the account when my father came across the bank statements in my room. He'd gone in to get something from my bookshelf, a book he'd lent me and wanted back, and brought them to the kitchen table with a look I can only describe as baffled. "Why didn't you tell us you opened an account?" my mother asked. "I didn't think I had to," I said. "It's just we would have helped you. We could have added you to one of our accounts." I wanted my own. There was a pause. My mother and father exchanged a look, one of those looks that carries a whole conversation in it, the kind of private language married people develop, and then my mother said carefully, "Is there something you're not telling us?" I stared at her. "What would I not be telling you?" "I don't know, you just seem very secretive lately." "I'm not secretive, I just didn't think I needed your permission to open a bank account." The conversation ended there, but it left a residue, a slight shift in the atmosphere, because the truth was I was becoming secretive, not in any dramatic sense, not hiding anything terrible, but privately building a life that was separate from my family, making decisions independently, creating small pockets of autonomy. And my mother sensed this, and it made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't articulate without revealing something about her need for control that she probably wasn't consciously aware of. Diane, that same summer, spent all the money from her birthday and Christmas gifts on new dance clothes and didn't save anything, and my mother's response to this was an affectionate shake of her head. "She's never going to be a saver," she said once, fondly, like it was a charming character trait. 2 standards, always 2 standards, one for the daughter who needed protecting and indulging, and one for the daughter who was expected to need nothing. I left for college at 18 and did not look back. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship that I had researched and applied for myself, 3 scholarships actually, 2 of which I got, and I studied pre-med with the kind of focus that comes not from passion alone, but from having something to prove, not to anyone else or not primarily, to myself, to the 7-year-old girl with the grapes who had been told she was selfish for wanting what was hers. My parents contributed to my tuition, less than they contributed to Diane's, though Diane was at a less expensive school, but I'm not going to spend too much time on the accounting. I learned to not spend too much time on the accounting. You can drive yourself to madness trying to balance the ledger of parental fairness, and the ledger never balances, and in the end the only thing that matters is whether you got out. I got out. My first week at college I met my roommate, a woman named Priya Anand, who was from New Jersey and talked fast and laughed loud and had an opinion about everything and was not afraid to share it. She was the first truly confident woman my age I had ever spent significant time with, and I was fascinated by her. Not romantically, Priya and I were never that, though we loved each other fiercely, but in the way you're fascinated by something you don't understand and want to learn. She didn't apologize for taking up space. She didn't make herself smaller so other people would feel more comfortable. She had been told her whole life that she was smart and capable and worth taking seriously, and she believed it, and watching her navigate the world from inside, that belief was like watching someone who had learned to swim move through water that I had always found terrifying. We became friends slowly. She was not the kind of person who became friends fast. She tested people, poked at them a little, watched how they responded to being poked. I apparently passed her tests, because by October of our first year we were having dinner together every night and calling each other on weekend mornings and sharing everything. She was the first person I ever told about Diane and my parents, not in the careful minimizing way I'd always talked about my family before, but honestly, the full truth of it. "That sounds really painful," she said. We were sitting on the floor of our dorm room with takeout containers between us, and she said it without pity, without drama, just a quiet acknowledgement. "It sounds really painful." 5 words. But they were the first 5 words anyone had ever said to me in response to my real experience with my family, and I cried just briefly, and then pretended I wasn't crying, and Priya handed me a napkin and changed the subject to something else and never mentioned it again, unless I brought it up first. She understood instinctively that what I needed was to be acknowledged, not to be made into a project. I kept my grades up through college on nothing but stubbornness and caffeine, and the occasionally irrational conviction that I had to be better than anyone expected. I graduated with a 3.9 GPA and got into medical school, a real one, a good one, in Pennsylvania, and called my parents to tell them. My mother said, "That's wonderful, Caroline," and then asked me to hold on because Diane was on the other line, and I waited for 4 minutes before she came back and wrapped up our call in another 45 seconds. I told myself it didn't matter. It did matter. I have made my peace with the fact that it mattered. Medical school was the crucible. 4 years of sleep deprivation and information overload, and the specific existential dread of knowing that your mistakes will one day have consequences you cannot undo. I was good at it in the way I'd been good at most things, not effortlessly, not brilliantly, but through sheer force of sustained effort. I studied more than most of my classmates. I asked more questions. I made more flashcards. I failed one shelf exam and cried about it alone in my apartment, and then retook it and passed, and never mentioned it to anyone. I did my residency in emergency medicine, which seemed insane to some people. Why would anyone choose emergency medicine, with its chaos and its night shifts and its unrelenting stream of human suffering, but made perfect sense to me. I liked the clarity of it. In the ER, problems declared themselves immediately. The body spoke in unmistakable language. There was no ambiguity about whether something was wrong. It was either wrong or it wasn't, and your job was to figure out how wrong and how fast you had to respond. I found this clarifying in a way I couldn't entirely explain. After a childhood spent trying to read between the lines of my family's emotional atmosphere, trying to detect the subtle shifts in temperature that meant I was in disfavor again, there was something deeply satisfying about a world where the signals were clear. I did 6 years of residency and fellowship, and emerged on the other side as a 30-year-old attending physician in the emergency department of a mid-sized hospital in Columbus, Ohio. I had come back to Ohio not because of any particular attachment to the state, but because the job was good and the cost of living was reasonable, and I was tired of making decisions based on escape. By this point I had not lived near my family in 12 years. I went home for Christmas, not every year but most, and those visits had a particular texture, polite, slightly tense, characterized by long stretches of surface conversation and the specific exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that doesn't quite fit. Diane had married a man named Rick who worked in insurance and was aggressively average in every way I could detect. They had 2 children, a boy, Mason, who was 8, and a girl, Lily, who was 5. My parents adored them with a completeness and a visibility that I tried not to compare to the way they'd adored, or not adored, me at the same ages. Diane and I were not close. We were not exactly not close either. We existed in that particular sibling zone of people who have shared a history and a home but have very little in common beyond it, who are polite to each other at family gatherings and don't call between them. She knew I was a doctor. I knew she'd given up dance after her second knee injury. We asked each other surface questions and answered them with surface answers and did not go deeper, because going deeper would have required both of us to acknowledge things we had tacitly agreed not to acknowledge. The last Christmas I went home before the silence, before the 3 years of not calling, was 4 years ago. I was 30, Diane was 28. Mason and Lily were charging around the living room in a frenzy of wrapping paper and plastic packaging, and my mother was on the floor with them, playing, genuinely happy in a way I rarely saw her, and my father was in his armchair with a glass of bourbon watching the whole scene with a soft expression I recognized as love, real, uncomplicated love, for his grandchildren. I sat on the couch with a mug of coffee and watched all of this and felt nothing for a moment, Not resentment, not longing, just a clean, empty noticing. And then I felt something unexpected, which was grief. Not for myself exactly, for something that might have been and wasn't, for some alternate version of this family in which I had always felt like I belonged to it. I went back to Columbus on December 26th. I told my mother I had to work, which was partially true. She hugged me goodbye with both arms and said, "It's so good to see you, we don't do this enough," and I said, "We don't," and I drove away and something in me quietly closed. I want to tell you about a man named Daniel. I met him 2 years before the silence, so 2 years before that last Christmas, when I was 28 and had recently moved to Columbus and was still figuring out what my life looked like when I wasn't in training. He was not a doctor, which I appreciated. I dated a fellow resident for 8 months during my 3rd year and found the experience claustrophobic in a specific way, 2 people in the same fishbowl making the fishbowl smaller. Daniel was a high school English teacher who coached the girls' soccer team and read more books than anyone I'd ever met outside of academia. He had brown hair that needed cutting and a way of listening to you that made you feel like what you were saying was the only thing in the world that mattered at that moment. I fell in love with him slowly. I was not a fast faller. I was suspicious of that, of the people who felt things immediately and intensely, because I had learned from early on that intensity could be a distraction from truth. I fell in love with Daniel the way you notice it's gotten dark, gradually and then all at once, and then you can't remember what it looked like before. He was patient with my specific brand of emotional guardedness. He didn't push where I didn't want to be pushed, but he didn't accept my minimizing either. If I said I'm fine in a way that clearly meant I wasn't, he would look at me steadily and say, "Okay, but actually how are you?" and wait. He introduced me to his friends, who were warm and funny and treated me from the beginning like I was part of the group. He met my few close friends, Priya, by then living in Chicago but visiting often, my colleague Marcus, who had become my closest work friend, and was genuinely interested in them, asked them real questions, remembered details from previous conversations. I told him about my family earlier than I'd told most people because he asked in that way of his that made it impossible to deflect. I gave him the broad strokes, the Diane favoritism, the years of being the less loved child, the slow emotional departure from my family that had culminated in something approaching estrangement. He listened. He didn't offer opinions. He asked, "How do you feel about it now?" And I said honestly, tired of it. I think I've been angry about it for so long that the anger has just become part of the furniture. I've stopped noticing it. He nodded, he took my hand, he said, "That makes sense." We dated for 2 years. I was happy in the way that happiness feels when it's the real thing, not constant, not uncomplicated, but consistent in the way that reliable things are consistent. A warm room you can come back to. I was 30 when I started thinking about whether this was going somewhere, whether we were building something together, and I thought we were. I thought we both thought we were. The end of Daniel is not a dramatic story. It doesn't have a villain. That's part of what made it so hard to process. There was no one to be angry at, no betrayal I could point to and say, "That's when it broke." We'd been together for 2 years and 4 months when he told me, gently and with what I believe was genuine regret, that he'd been feeling for several months that we were moving in different directions, that he wanted a life that looked different from the one he thought I wanted. He wanted to stay in one place, he said, grown up moving constantly, and it had marked him, and I was still, he felt, searching for something, still not sure where home was. I told him that was unfair. He said maybe, but it was also honest. "I love you," he said, "I'm just not sure that's enough." That sentence broke something in me that I hadn't known was breakable. Not because it was cruel, it wasn't, but because it was, in its way, the same sentence my family had been saying to me my entire life without using words. "I love you, but it's not quite enough. You are loved, but loved differently, loved less completely, loved with a footnote." I did not cry in front of him. I cried alone in my bathroom, sitting on the edge of the tub, for about 45 minutes. And then I washed my face and went to work because I had a 12-hour shift and people needed things from me. And in the ER, people's needs are always larger and more urgent than your own heartbreak. That was the year before the last Christmas. And then came the last Christmas and the closed-door feeling and the 3 years of silence, which was not a dramatic silence, no screaming fight, no final declaration, just an erosion. My calls home becoming less frequent. My mother's calls to me becoming more predictably about Diane, Diane's kids, Diane's house, a renovation Rick was doing, something Mason said at school that was funny, not maliciously, just habitually, just thoughtlessly. And one day I realized I had gone 6 months without calling home and I didn't feel anything about it, and I thought, maybe that's the answer. Maybe the answer is this. So I stopped calling. My mother called twice in the first month, left voicemails I didn't return. Diane texted once, "Mom says you've gone quiet, everything okay?" And I texted back, "Yes, just busy with work, talk soon," which was a lie wrapped in true words. My father didn't call at all, which was entirely characteristic of him, and also somehow the thing that hurt the most. 3 years of this. 3 years of building a life that was entirely mine. My apartment in Clintonville with its good light and its proximity to the park. My work at the hospital, which gave me purpose and exhaustion in equal and manageable measure. My friendships with Priya and Marcus, and a handful of others who had accumulated slowly over time the way good things accumulate. I had therapy, once a week with a woman named Dr. Lin, who was approximately 400 years old, and did not take any of my deflections seriously. I had a cat, Herbert, who was orange and judgmental and sat on my medical journals. I had routines and rituals and a small garden on my apartment's balcony where I grew herbs I used maybe 3 times a year, but tended with great care. I was not happy in a blissful way, but I was stable. I was present in my own life. I was, for the first time I could remember, not waiting for something, not waiting to be seen or chosen or loved correctly, just living the life I had. And then my phone rang in the hospital parking garage, and it was my mother, and I let it go to voicemail. She called again the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day she left a voicemail that I almost didn't listen to. I had a habit of deleting them without listening, but something made me stop. Her voice was different, smaller, like the air had been let out of it. "Caroline, it's Mom, I know things haven't been." She stopped, took a breath. "Your father is in the hospital, I don't want to. I'm not trying to manipulate you with this, I just thought you should know. He had a cardiac event on Tuesday. They're saying he needs surgery. I'm not asking you to come, Another pause. "I thought you should know." I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and listened to the silence at the end of the voicemail, and then I listened to it again. His name was Gerald Jones. He was my father. He had called me Care Bear until I was 12 and taught me to change a tire and made the best chili I'd ever tasted, and had never, not once in my 34 years, defended me from my mother's preference for my sister. He was a real person with real dimensions. He was 70 years old and had a heart that was failing, and I was an emergency medicine physician, and he was my father. I called my mother back. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been holding her phone. "Caroline," just my name. Not "thank God" or "finally," just my name in her smaller voice. "Tell me what happened," I said. "Tell me exactly what they told you." Here is what they had told her, which she relayed imperfectly but with enough information that I could fill in the gaps. My father had had what sounded like a moderate myocardial infarction, a heart attack, on Tuesday morning while he was in the backyard. My mother had found him sitting on the patio steps looking grey and holding his chest, and had called 911, which she had done correctly and quickly, which probably mattered. He'd been taken to St. Matthew's Hospital in their city, not a large hospital but adequate, where they determined he had significant blockages and was recommending a CABG, a coronary artery bypass graft, 3-vessel disease. The surgery was being planned for the following week. I asked who the cardiologist was. I asked about his ejection fraction. I asked about his other labs. My mother said she didn't know those things, that she'd been writing things down, but some of the words didn't make sense to her. "Can you send me what you wrote down?" I said. "Yes," she said, and then quietly, "Will you come?" I was very still for a moment. "Let me arrange some things," I said. "I want to stop here and be honest about something, because this story has to be honest or it's worth nothing." I did not immediately feel the kind of warm, forgiving rush that movies and television have trained us to expect in moments like this. The prodigal return, the dissolved bitterness, the reconciliation scored with something swelling and gentle. What I felt was more complicated and less photogenic. I felt a kind of flat competence engage. Asterisk, here is a medical problem, here is how I can help, asterisk, layered underneath with something that I can only describe as the oldest sadness I knew. Not fresh grief, old, dried grief, the grief of everything that hadn't happened between us, and underneath even that, if I'm being completely honest, something smaller and more shameful, a flicker of something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was in the neighborhood of it. Now you need me. Now I am the one you're calling. I am not proud of that flicker. I am honest about it because pretending it didn't exist would be a lie, and because I think most people who have been in similar situations would recognize it, even if they never say it out loud. I arranged 3 days off from my attending rotation. Marcus covered for me, no questions asked, just go, I've got it. And I drove to my parents' city, which was 2.5 hours from Columbus. I drove with the radio off and Herbert fed and watered by my neighbor, and I thought about nothing in particular and everything in general. The exit ramp I'd taken 1,000 times growing up, the Denny's where we used to go after church, the water tower painted with the city name in letters that were always slightly faded. I pulled into my parents' driveway on a Thursday afternoon and sat in the car for 3 minutes before I got out. My mother opened the front door before I could knock. She looked older. She was 67, and the last 3 years had apparently done something to her face, not drastically but noticeably in the way that stress organizes itself in the skin. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was holding a dish towel that she was twisting in her hands. "You came," she said. "I said I would," I said. She stepped back from the door to let me in, and I went inside my parents' house for the first time in 3 years and smelled the particular smell of it, my father's woodworking, my mother's cleaning products, something cooking somewhere, and the oldest part of me responded to it like a reflex, the way the body remembers things the mind would rather not. "How is he?" I said. "Stable," she said. "Better today, he was asking about you." I looked at her. He was. He said, "Do you think Care Bear will come?" Her voice broke just slightly on the nickname. "That's what he called you." "I know," I said. "I'll go to the hospital tomorrow morning. I want to look at his chart before anything else." "Of course," she said. "Of course, are you hungry?" I made. "I'm fine," I said, and then heard myself say it and thought about Daniel, about the way he'd seen through that phrase, and I said, "Actually, yes. Whatever you made is fine." She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since I'd walked in, and something moved across her face that I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or recognition. We ate dinner together in the kitchen, my mother and I, and it was very quiet, and I asked her questions about my father's health history that she answered as carefully as she could, consulting the notes she'd made, and it was the most substantive conversation we'd had in years, and it was happening because something had gone terribly wrong. I thought about that while I ate, how crisis does what ordinary time cannot. It burns away everything unnecessary and leaves you with just the essential things: the table, the food, the woman across from you who is your mother, the fact that you are here when you almost weren't. Diane arrived the next morning. I had not been told she was coming, or rather, I had not thought to ask, which is something I've thought about since. I had assumed, without examining the assumption, that this would be me and my mother dealing with my father's medical situation, and that Diane was existing somewhere in the periphery of it the way she always had, present and beloved but not particularly useful in practical terms. I don't say that with cruelty. Diane is not a person with practical skills, she has other skills. She came with Rick, who was beige in all senses of the word, and without the children, who were staying with Rick's parents. She came into the house in a way that was both genuine and performed, genuinely worried about my father, but performing the worry in a slightly amplified way. The way she had always performed her emotions, turned up a few degrees, because she had learned from early on that her emotions were responded to, and mine weren't, and so she'd unconsciously developed a habit of ensuring they were visible. She hugged my mother for a long time, then she hugged me briefly. With a "Hey, Care, good to see you," that was warm but not warm like the hug she'd given my mother. "Tell me everything," she said to my mother, sitting down at the kitchen table with Rick hovering behind her like a beige security guard. My mother told her everything. I had heard most of it already. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and listened to the retelling and noticed that my mother, in Diane's presence, was fractionally more animated, less collapsed into herself, more like her usual self, as if Diane's presence was restorative in a way mine wasn't. I told myself this didn't matter. It mattered, but less than it used to. I had done enough therapy to know the difference between a wound and a scar. A wound hurts when you press it. A scar is just changed tissue. It's there, it doesn't feel like normal skin, but it doesn't hurt the same way. We went to the hospital together that afternoon, all of us including Rick, and I will say this for Diane, she was good with my father in his hospital room. She was warm and easy and she made him laugh, which was genuinely hard to do with someone who was physically weakened and frightened, and I watched her do it and felt something uncomplicated, which was gratitude. She was doing something I couldn't do as easily. I could read his chart and talk to his cardiologist and assess his medications and worry about his ejection fraction, but I couldn't make him laugh the way Diane could. She was doing her thing, I was doing mine. I had spoken to the cardiologist before we went in, a Dr. Patel who was competent and thorough, and clearly not used to a family member who was an ED physician and wanted to talk in clinical terms, and had established that my father's situation was serious but manageable with surgery, that the timing was appropriate, that the surgical team was experienced. I asked about postoperative care, about cardiac rehab, about medication management, and Dr. Patel answered all of it and then said at the end, "It's helpful that you're here. A lot of families struggle to navigate this. You clearly know what you're asking." "He's my father," I said, as if that explained everything, and maybe it did. My father was smaller in the hospital bed than I'd remembered him. He was 69. I'd had his age wrong in my head. I'd been thinking 70, but he was 69. And he looked like a man who had been argued with by his own body and lost. His colour was better than it had been on Tuesday, according to my mother, but he was grey around the edges in a way that people get when something serious has happened to them. He saw me come in and his face changed in a way that was hard to witness and also impossible not to love. He opened his mouth and said, "Care Bear," in a voice that was nothing like his normal voice, and I went to him and took his hand and said, "Hi, Dad." He squeezed my hand and didn't let go for a long time. Here is where I need to tell you something I hadn't expected. That evening, while Diane and Rick had gone out to get dinner, they'd asked if I wanted to come and I'd said I'd stay with my mother, which was true and also an excuse. My mother and I sat in the kitchen again. She made tea, which she'd always done in moments of stress, and she set mine in front of me without asking if I wanted it, and I picked it up and held it with both hands and waited. She sat down across from me. She was looking at her own mug. "I want to say something," she said. "Okay," I said. "I know that things between us, I know that you felt." She stopped, started again. "I know I haven't always been fair to you, in comparison to Diane." She was still looking at her mug. "I've thought about this a lot in the last 3 years, since you stopped calling." I didn't say anything. I let the words sit between us. "I didn't know how to reach you," she said. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid I was afraid you were done with us. And I thought about why that would be, and I kept coming back to the same things." She finally looked up. "I'm not going to make excuses. I just want to say I know and I'm sorry." These are the words I had wanted to hear for 34 years. Not these exact words, but words in this approximate shape. An acknowledgement, an apology, a recognition that the ledger was unbalanced and that she knew it. I had written versions of this conversation in my head hundreds of times. I had imagined my response in those versions. In some of them I cried. In some of them I told her all the things I'd never said. In some of them I was cold and precise and let her sit in the discomfort of it. What I actually did was pick up my tea and take a sip and look at the table for a moment, and then look up at her and say, "Thank you for saying that." She nodded, her eyes were wet. "It's going to take time," I said. "To be honest, I don't know what this looks like from here, but I'm glad you said it." "I know," she said, "I know it will." We sat there for a while, not talking, just sitting in the kitchen with our tea and the small sounds of the house around us, and my father somewhere in a hospital bed sleeping or not sleeping, and all of those years between us like furniture in a room that neither of us quite knew how to rearrange. The surgery was scheduled for Monday. I stayed through the weekend, which I had not originally planned to do. I'd only arranged 3 days off, but Marcus said he could manage another 2 days, and I called Dr. Lynn and told her I was with my family, and she said simply, "Good." Something happened on Saturday that I want to tell you about, because it changed the texture of everything that came after. I went for a walk on Saturday morning, early before anyone else was up, the particular grey gold of October dawn. I walked my old route without planning to, the one I used to walk when I was a teenager trying to escape the house without making it obvious I was escaping. Down Elm to Hargrove, left on Prospect, through the park with the pond, around the pond, back through the park on the other side. I had my coffee in a travel mug, and I walked slowly and I thought about nothing, which I was not very good at but was trying to practice. At the pond, at the bench where I used to sit and do homework in the summers, away from the house, which was chaos when Diane had dance friends over, there was someone already sitting. An old man in a green parka, not looking at the pond, just sitting with his hands folded in his lap. He must have been in his 80s. He had the comfortable stillness of someone who had learned how to sit without needing anything from the sitting. I almost kept walking. I didn't want company, wasn't in a social state of mind. But the bench was long and I was tired, and I sat down at the other end, at a distance that communicated I wasn't looking for conversation. He turned and looked at me anyway, not intrusively, just looked the way old people sometimes look at younger people, with a kind of interested but detached observation. "You're a worrier," he said. I looked at him. What? "The way you're holding your coffee. Worriers hold things like that with both hands, like they might get away." I looked down at my hands. He was right. I loosened my grip slightly. "My father's having surgery Monday," I said. I don't know why I told him. He was a stranger, which was probably exactly why. "Ah," he said, "are you a doctor?" "Emergency medicine." He nodded as if this explained something. Worst thing being a doctor when someone you love is sick. Too much, you know, not enough you can do. I stared at him. "Yeah," I said, "that's exactly it." He smiled, a small, private smile. My wife was a nurse for 40 years. When she got her diagnosis, she spent the first month researching every treatment option, reading every study. She knew everything there was to know about what was happening to her. He paused. And then she put all the papers away and said, "Well, I know everything I can know. Now I'm just going to live." I didn't say anything for a moment. The pond was very still. A bird landed on the surface and then took off again. "Did she?" I stopped. "She died," he said easily, without pain, or a pain so old it had become something else. 5 years ago, but she was right, knowing doesn't fix it, living does. He stood up then slowly, the careful way of someone whose knees have opinions. He nodded at me. "Good luck with your father," he said, and walked away along the path, and I watched him go and thought about what he'd said, and then I sat there for a while longer and just let myself feel frightened, which I hadn't let myself do yet. My father's surgery was on Monday. The CABG went well, 4 hours, successful graft, surgical team satisfied with the result. He was in the ICU for 24 hours and then moved to a step-down unit. His cardiologist said they expected a full recovery with appropriate lifestyle changes and cardiac rehab. I stayed until Wednesday. I reviewed his discharge medications with the care team and wrote a summary for my mother of what each medication was for and what side effects to watch for, and I made a list of cardiac rehab centers in their area and called 2 of them to check waitlist times. I set up a follow-up appointment with his cardiologist. I did all the things I knew how to do. Diane left on Tuesday. She had to get back to the kids, she said, and Rick had to be at work, and she cried when she left, genuinely, and hugged my father for a long time through the hospital bed rails, and hugged my mother and hugged me briefly and said, "Thank you for being here, really." She said it looking at me directly, without the gloss that usually sits over our interactions, and I believed her. "Really?" she said again. "Of course," I said. She left, and I stayed another day, and then I also left, and as I hugged my mother goodbye in the driveway, a real hug, longer than the one in October 3 years before, she held on for an extra moment and I felt her breath catch. "I missed you," she said into my hair. "I know I didn't know how to show you that, but I missed you." "I know," I said, and I almost said I missed you too, and then I stopped because I wanted to be honest, and the truth was more complicated than that. What I had missed was not them exactly, but the idea of them, the family I'd wanted but not quite had. The version of this where I didn't feel like the second one, the addendum, the Care Bear who needed less. But I also thought about the old man at the pond. Knowing doesn't fix it, living does. "I'll call," I said. "Maury, I will." She nodded. She let go of me. I got in my car and drove back to Columbus. That was 2 months ago. What I haven't told you yet, what I've been circling around, what I have not known exactly how to say, is what happened in those 2 months between driving away from my parents' house and now. Priya came to Columbus the week after I got back. She drove down from Chicago, which she didn't do casually. Chicago to Columbus is a real drive, not a casual weekend trip. And she showed up at my door with a bottle of wine and take-out containers, and her particular way of looking at you, "That means I am here, tell me everything." We sat on my living room floor with Herbert between us. He immediately claimed Priya as his person, as he always did, because he had good taste, and I told her everything. The drive to my parents' city, the hospital, my father in the bed smaller than I'd remembered, my mother's apology, Diane arriving and making my father laugh, the old man at the pond. Priya listened to all of it without interrupting, which was notable for her. "How do you feel?" she said when I'd finished. "I don't know," I said, "complicated." "What's the loudest feeling?" I thought about this. Herbert blinked slowly at me. "Something like relief, but not the nice kind, the kind that's exhausting, like you've been holding a door shut for a really long time and someone finally just told you can let go." Priya nodded. She poured more wine into my glass. "She apologized," I said. "Yes. Is that enough?" Priya was quiet for a moment. "I don't think that's the right question," she said finally. "I don't think it's a question of enough. An apology doesn't undo the thing. It opens a door. It's up to you whether you walk through it. And if I'm not sure I want to, then you don't yet." I leaned back against the couch. Herbert climbed onto my lap in his imperious way, turned 3 times, settled. "She looked so old," I said. "My mother, she looked old and scared and like she wasn't sure I was going to come even when I said I would." I looked at the ceiling. "She called Diane first. When my dad had the heart attack, she called Diane and then she called me 4 days later." Priya didn't say anything. "I know why," I said. "I know why she called Diane first. Diane is the one she turns to. Diane is," I stopped. "Even now, after everything, she called Diane first." "That hurt," Priya said. "Yes. You went anyway." "Yes. That's not nothing," Priya said. "The going, that's actually quite a lot." I thought about that. I'd been thinking about it in the background of the week since, the way you think about something without realizing you're thinking about it. Why did I go? The easy answer was because he was my father and he needed help. But that wasn't all of it. I went because, and this is the part I've had to sit with, I went because not going would have made me into someone I didn't want to be. I had spent my childhood having something done to me, a kind of passive harm, and I had the choice in that parking garage to respond to it in kind, or to respond as the person I had actually become. And the person I had actually become was someone who could look at her father's name in a voicemail and think, "He is 69 years old and he is frightened and he needs me," and get in the car. That is the thing I want to be, not because of some moral principle about forgiveness, but because it's who I am, who I worked for many years to become. Here is the thing I haven't told you. The dark thing, the thing that is still turning over in my mind. 2 weeks after I got back to Columbus, Priya called me. Not a visit this time, just a call, and said, "I need to tell you something, and I want to preface it by saying I didn't know if this was my information to share, but I've decided it is because you have a right to know." "Okay," I said. I was eating toast over my kitchen sink. I put the toast down. "Remember I went to Diane's birthday party," Priya said, 3 years ago, when you couldn't go because of the overnight shift?" I remembered. I'd sent Diane a gift card and Priya had gone as a kind of family proxy, which sounds strange but was actually the natural result of Priya having somehow, over the years, become close with my family independently of me. She liked them in a complicated way, and they liked her, and she went to things I couldn't. "Yes," I said. "I ran into your cousin Rachel at that party, Rachel Chen." Rachel Chen was my mother's sister's daughter, my first cousin, whom I saw occasionally at family events and liked well enough without being close to. She was about 5 years older than me, a quiet woman who worked in accounting and lived 40 minutes from my parents. "Okay," I said. "She told me something that night," Priya said, "and I've been trying to figure out ever since whether to tell you, and I've decided you should know." "Priya, your mother had a miscarriage," Priya said. "Between you and Diane, a boy, they'd have named him Thomas." I stood very still. "They lost him at 22 weeks, Priya said. "Rachel didn't know all the details, but she knew it was. She said it was really bad, that your mother almost didn't come through it. And afterward your aunt told Rachel in one of those things where you share too much, she apparently had what sounds like severe postpartum depression or maybe grief depression for a long time. Well into having Diane." I was silent for a very long time. "Caroline, I'm here," I said. "I don't know what it means," Priya said. "For how she treated you, I'm not saying it excuses it, I just thought you should know that there was something happening with her during those years, something she never talked about." She never talked about it, I said, not a question. Not to you, maybe not to anyone. Rachel only knew because her mother, your aunt, had been there, at the time. I thought about this. I thought about my mother, 25 years old, losing a son at 22 weeks. I thought about what that does to a person, to their capacity for attachment, for trust, for the willingness to be fully in love with something that could be taken from you. I thought about Diane being born into that, the baby after the loss, the child who arrived in the aftermath of grief, who might have been held differently, loved differently, because she was proof that love survived. I thought about myself, the firstborn, the one who had been born before the loss, before everything changed, who my mother had perhaps loved more easily, more fully, before she knew what love could cost. I thought about the grapes. I don't have a neat explanation for this. I'm not a psychologist and this is not a therapy session, and grief does not always translate cleanly into behavior, and even if it did, my mother's grief would not excuse the years of imbalance, the ways she made me feel less than, the ways she failed me. These things are both true. Something terrible happened to my mother that changed her, and she still should have done better. Both are true, they can coexist. But the knowing of it did something to me. Not absolution, nothing so clean, something more like the shift in perspective you get when you look at a picture you've been staring at for years and suddenly see the other image hidden in it. The sailboat that was always also a face. You can't unsee it once you've seen it, and now you have two pictures where you had one, and you have to figure out what to do with both of them. I called my mother the following Sunday, not because I'd resolved anything, not because I had arrived at some new emotional equilibrium, but because I'd said I would call more, and I meant it. She answered on the second ring. Caroline, she said, not small this time, Maury normal. How's Dad? I said. Better, she said. He went to his first cardiac rehab session yesterday. He hated it. He would, I said. He said, she laughed just slightly. He said it was like gym class with more equipment and more lecturing. I said, well, yes, that's exactly what it is. I smiled. Good, I said. He needs to hate it. If he loves it, he's not working hard enough. She laughed again, a real one this time. And we talked, for 22 minutes, which was longer than we'd talked on the phone in years, about my father's rehabilitation and her book club, and whether the roof needed replacing, and Herbert when I told her about him, which she said she was glad I had company, and then said, I always thought you'd have a cat. You were always very self-sufficient. I considered this word, self-sufficient. I considered whether it was a compliment or an observation made in ignorance of what had made me that way, and then I decided it was both, and that was fine. Mom, I said, and then I didn't say what I'd been thinking about saying, about Thomas, about what Priya had told me. I held it for a moment, not the right time, maybe not something that needed to be said at all, or not yet. Nothing, I'll call again next week. I'd like that, she said. We said goodbye and I hung up and sat on my couch with Herbert and thought about the old man at the pond. Knowing doesn't fix it, living does. I want to tell you about something that happened at work, a month ago, because it's the part of this story that I've been sitting with most, the part that feels like it has something important in it that I'm still trying to understand. I work overnight shifts twice a week, 12 hours, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and on these nights the ER has a particular character. The chaos is different from daytime chaos. It's more concentrated, punctuated by stretches of quiet that make you jumpy, interrupted by things that are terrible or strange or both. You see a lot of loneliness on overnight shifts. You see a lot of people who have no one to call. About a month ago, on an overnight, we had a patient come in at around 2 a.m, a woman named Margaret Ellison, 71 years old, brought in by EMS after her neighbour had called 911. She'd fallen in her kitchen and hadn't been able to get up. She'd been on the floor for several hours by the time anyone found her. She wasn't critically injured, a hairline fracture in her left wrist, some bruising, some hypothermia, but she was frightened and disoriented in the way that elderly patients sometimes are in the ER at 2 a.m, when everything is bright and loud and strange. She kept asking about her cat. She had a cat named Chester, she said, and no one had fed Chester, and who was going to feed Chester? I am a practical person. I am also, apparently, a person who will find out whether a 71-year-old woman's cat has been fed. I asked her neighbour's name, Mrs. Park, the neighbour who had called 911. I asked if she had Mrs. Park's number. She gave it to me from memory, because elderly people still remember phone numbers, and I went on my break at 3 a.m. and called Mrs. Park and explained the situation, and Mrs. Park said, "Oh yes, of course, I have a key, I'll go now." she went. She sent a text to the number I'd called from with a photo of Chester eating, with the caption, "Chester is fine. You go back to work." I showed Margaret Ellison the photo. She looked at it for a long time. Chester was a large grey cat with a suspicious expression, and in the photo he was eating from a bowl with great concentration. Margaret Ellison looked at this photo and her shoulders dropped. You could see them actually drop, the tension releasing, and she said, "He always eats like that, like someone is going to take it away from him." "I know that feeling," I said, and then was surprised I'd said it because it was more honest than I usually was with patients. But she laughed, a real laugh, and squeezed my hand with her good hand and said, "You're a good doctor, honey." "I'm just the one who's here," I said. But I thought about it on the drive home. Not about what I'd done making a phone call, it wasn't heroic, but about why it had mattered so much to her. Chester was a cat. Chester was going to be fine regardless of when he ate. But to Margaret Ellison, alone on the floor for several hours with nothing between her and the ceiling but fear, Chester was the most important thing in the world. And someone had thought to ask about Chester. I thought about the things that matter most to people, how they are almost never the things we expect, how the question that changes someone's experience of a terrible night is not, "Are your vitals stable?" but "What is your cat's name and has he been fed?" I thought about the old man at the pond. I thought about Sandra at the pharmacy, quizzing me on medications while we stocked shelves. I thought about Mr. Aldridge, who told me I asked better questions than most of his students twice my age, not because he was trying to flatter me, but because he found me interesting. I thought about Priya on the floor of our dorm room, handing me a napkin and changing the subject, understanding what I needed better than I understood it myself. I thought about small things, how they are never just small. There's something I haven't told you about why my parents called me specifically, something I learned or pieced together in the weeks after the visit. It was not just because I am a doctor, though that was part of it. It was not just because my father had a cardiac event, though that was the occasion for it. Before my father's heart attack, before my mother left that voicemail with the smaller voice, something else had happened that I didn't find out about until Diane told me, 2 weeks after I got back to Columbus, in a phone call that surprised me because Diane and I don't call each other. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "I wanted to talk to you about something." What she told me was this: 6 months before my father's heart attack, my parents had been having financial problems, real ones, not catastrophic but serious. My father had made some investments that hadn't done well. There were debts I hadn't known about. They'd been trying to manage it quietly without telling Diane and Rick, and certainly without telling me because they didn't want to appear as if they were asking for money. Diane had found out because my mother had accidentally sent her an email meant for my father, something about a second mortgage, about whether it was the right time, about the quarterly statements, and Diane had confronted her, and the whole picture had emerged. They were in trouble, Diane said, and they didn't tell anyone. Because they were embarrassed, I said. Yes, and because, Diane paused. Okay, I'm going to say something and I don't know how you're going to take it, but I think you deserve to know. Okays. They didn't tell you specifically, Diane said, because Mom was worried about how you'd react. She was afraid, she actually said this to me, she was afraid you'd see it as an opportunity. I was very still. An opportunity, I said. To make them feel bad, to point out that she thought you might hold it over them because of everything, because of how she treated you growing up. Diane's voice was careful. She thought you were still angry enough that you might not help, or that you'd help in a way that made them feel small. I sat with this. She said that, I said. She said that. The silence between us was long and not comfortable. She was wrong, I said finally. I know, Diane said. I told her that. I said Caroline came and handled everything. She never made anyone feel small. She was more professional and more kind than she had any reason to be, and you should call her and tell her you know that. A pause. Did she? Not exactly, I said. She apologized for the general thing, not the specific thing. Yeah, Diane said. That's about as far as she can usually get. Something in the casualness of that sentence, asterisk, that's about as far as she can usually get, asterisk, made me realize that Diane knew, had always known. At some level, the dynamic we'd all lived inside. She'd benefited from it, yes, she'd been the favored one, but she wasn't oblivious to it and she wasn't defending it. I said. Yes. Did you know, growing up, how different it was? Silence, a longer silence. Sort of, she said. I knew things were easier for me, I didn't always know why. Another pause. I think I was afraid to look at it too hard, because if I looked at it I'd have to do something about it, and I was a kid, and what was I supposed to do? Nothing, I said, you were a kid. I still feel bad about it, she said. I want you to know that. I looked out my window at my balcony garden, the herb pots, the rosemary that had somehow survived the summer, the lavender that was technically dead but that I kept anyway for its smell. Okay, I said. Okay, you believe me. Okay, I hear you, I said. I'm processing. I paused. I don't want to tell you it's fine when it isn't, but I also don't want to hold it against you. That's fair, she said. Can we try to actually know each other, as adults, not as the roles we were assigned? Another pause, shorter this time. Yeah, Diane said, I'd like that. The last thing I want to tell you happened last week. I was on a morning shift, and at the end of 12 hours, when the relief team was coming in, and I was organizing my notes and thinking about nothing but Herbert and my bed, one of the nurses, a woman named Jamie who has worked the ER for 15 years, and has seen everything and remains, inexplicably, one of the warmest people I know, handed me a folded piece of paper. This is from Mrs. Ellison, she said. She asked me to give it to you next time you were in. I unfolded it in the parking lot. It was written on floral notepaper in handwriting that was slightly shaky but careful. Dr. Jones, it said, I wanted to write to thank you for the night I came in. Not for the medical things, though I'm grateful for those too, for asking about Chester. I know it seems like nothing, but it wasn't nothing. I've been alone for 11 years since my husband died, and most of the time people see me as a problem to be solved. You saw me as a person. I don't always feel like a person anymore. That night I did, thank you. Chester is fine, by the way. He's sitting on my feet right now, and weighing about 11 pounds more than he should. P.S. I told my neighbour Mrs. Park about you. She says you sound wonderful. She is usually right about these things. I stood in the parking lot with this piece of paper, and I thought about something that doesn't make sense to say out loud, but that I'll say anyway because this is the kind of story where you say the thing that doesn't make sense. I thought this is what I was for, not the tests I aced, not the scholarships I won, not even the lives I've helped save in this over 4 years of attending. All of it led to the night I called Mrs. Park at 3 a.m. about a cat named Chester, and Margaret Ellison felt like a person. Everything I'd survived, all the grapes and the mildewed room and the test scores that were never quite the right kind of impressive, and Daniel's quiet departure, and 3 years of silence, all of it had made me into someone who, at 2 a.m, thought to ask about the cat. I folded Mrs. Ellison's letter and put it in my coat pocket. I drove home. Herbert was sitting on the kitchen counter, which he knows is forbidden, and when I came in he looked at me with his perfect orange face, and I thought about my father's face when I came into his hospital room, and my mother's face in the driveway when she didn't let go, and the old man at the pond who told me his wife had put away all her papers and decided to live. I fed Herbert. I stood in my kitchen in the October morning light, and I thought about calling my mother, not because everything was resolved, it wasn't, and it might never be, not entirely. Not because the ledger was balanced, not because I'd forgiven everything in the sense of having forgotten it or made it not matter, but because I was 34 years old and I was standing in my kitchen in the morning and Herbert was eating, and the rosemary on my balcony had somehow survived again, and I had a letter in my pocket from a woman who'd felt like a person, and because I had learned, very slowly at great cost over many years, that the way through things is not under them or around them but through them. That knowing doesn't fix it. Living does. I picked up my phone and I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. Caroline, she said. And I said, Hi, Mom, tell me about Dad's cardiac rehab. Did he complain the whole time or just most of it? And she laughed, a real one, the kind that starts in the chest, and began to tell me, and I sat down at my kitchen table and I listened. And outside the window the October light was doing the thing it does in Ohio, going gold and low and sideways through the leaves, and Herbert finished eating and jumped onto my lap, and I held him there with one hand and held the phone with the other, and I let myself be in it, this imperfect, complicated, continuing thing, without waiting for it to be more than it was. That's the thing about living, it doesn't ask you to be ready, it just asks you to show up. So you show up, you answer the phone, you call back, You drive 2.5 hours, you ask about the cat. You make the tea. You push the grapes across the table and let your sister take them and tell yourself it doesn't matter, and then you grow up and you learn that it did matter. It mattered very much, and you grieve that quietly and completely, and then you put your hands back in your life. My name is Caroline Jones. I am 34 years old. My father is alive and complaining about cardiac rehab. My mother is reading a book this week about the history of salt. She told me during our call, laughing at herself, and she called me Sunday and we talked for 31 minutes. My sister and I are figuring out how to know each other. There is a woman named Margaret Ellison whose cat is named Chester and weighs 11 pounds more than he should. The morning light in Ohio is gold and sideways, and everything I survived to see it. That's where we are,